The little girl's hand was cold in his, and Muhammad Ali could feel her fear through that tiny grip as they walked through the hospital corridor where children came to die. It was December 1974, 2 months after he'd shocked the world in Zaire, and the nurse leading them had warned him that this particular ward was difficult, that some visitors couldn't handle it, that he could leave any time if it became too much. But Ali had squeezed the girl's hand tighter and kept walking, his championship belt over his shoulder feeling suddenly meaningless against the weight of what waited behind those doors. How do you explain death to a 7-year-old who's already living with it? Her name was Christina, though she'd told him to call her Christie when they'd met in the waiting room 20 minutes earlier. Her mother crying quietly in a chair while Christie played with a worn stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. The doctors had given her 3 months, maybe 4 if the experimental treatment worked, and her mother had written to Ali's management team asking if the champ could visit, could give her daughter something to smile about before the leukemia took her away. Ali had read that letter on a plane somewhere between Las Vegas and New York, and it had broken something in him that victories in the ring never quite fixed. The pediatric oncology ward smelled like antiseptic and fear, that particular combination of cleaning products trying to mask the scent of illness, and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh white glow that made the pale children look even more ghostly. Christie's hand was warm now from holding his, and she was chattering about the fight in Zaire, asking questions about George Foreman and the heat and whether he'd really been scared, her voice bright and alive in a way that seemed impossible given what her body was doing to her. What do you say when a child asks if you were scared and you're talking to someone braver than you'll ever be? Ali had told her the truth. Yes, he'd been scared, terrified actually, because Foreman hit like a freight train and everyone thought Ali was going to get killed in that ring. But he'd also been sure of something deeper, something beyond fear, a certainty that he was meant to be there in that moment doing that thing. Christie had nodded seriously, like she understood exactly what he meant. Like maybe she had her own certainties that carried her through the terror of what her doctors kept saying in gentle voices that couldn't hide the finality. The hallway seemed endless, doors on both sides with name cards and cheerful stickers that couldn't disguise what lay beyond them. Through some of the open doors, Ali could see other children, some sleeping, some staring at televisions, some being tended to by nurses who moved with practiced efficiency that came from repeating these motions hundreds of times. A cart rattled past them, carrying medications, and the sound echoed off the sterile walls, a metallic reminder that this was a place of science and procedure where hope came measured in milligrams and blood counts. Could science save what faith couldn't, or were they both just different ways of begging for more time? They'd reached Christie's room, a small space she shared with another girl, and Christie had let go of his hand to run inside, suddenly animated, wanting to show him her drawings taped to the wall beside her bed. The other bed was empty, freshly made with hospital corners so tight you could bounce a quarter off them, and the nurse's face had tightened when Ali glanced at it, a silent communication that the previous occupant wouldn't be coming back. The drawings were remarkable. Castles and dragons and princesses and knights, all rendered in crayon with the kind of detail that suggested hours of careful work, hours of distraction from the IV poles standing sentinel beside the bed. Each drawing told a story, Christie explained, her small voice filling the room with narratives about brave princesses who fought monsters and won, about castles that could withstand any siege, about magic that could heal any wound. Ali had listened, really listened, understanding that these weren't just children's fantasies, but survival mechanisms, ways of processing a reality too terrible to face directly. In Christie's drawings, good always triumphed, heroes never died, and happy endings were guaranteed. Everything her actual life wasn't offering her. How many hours had she spent creating worlds she'd never get to live in? Ali had examined each drawing with genuine attention, asking about the stories behind them, and Christie had explained the elaborate mythology she'd constructed. A fantasy realm where magic could cure anything and heroes always won and nobody died before they were supposed to. Her words had painted pictures more vivid than the crayons, and Ali had found himself pulled into her imagination, forgetting for moments at a time where they were and why she was here. The room had a window that looked out onto the parking lot, and through it Ali could see normal people coming and going, visiting other patients or heading to work in the hospital, all of them moving through their day without the weight that pressed down on this particular floor. The December sun was weak, filtered through clouds that threatened rain, and the light it cast into the room was gray and thin, making the crayon colors on Christie's drawings seem even more vibrant by contrast. Then she'd asked him to draw something, handed him a red crayon with complete trust that the heavyweight champion of the world could create art, and Ali had laughed, tried to explain that his talent was in his fists, not his fingers, but she'd insisted with that particular stubbornness that sick children develop when so much has been taken from their control. So he'd drawn a rough butterfly, crooked and childlike, the wings uneven and the body too thick. But Christie had watched him with intense focus, like she was memorizing every stroke. Why did his hands shake slightly as he drew? And was it just the nervousness of performing under a child's scrutiny, or the beginning of what would come later? Christie had loved it, declared it her favorite, and taped it right in the center of her collection, giving it pride of place among her castles and dragons. Her mother had appeared in the doorway then, eyes red from crying, makeup smudged where she'd tried to wipe away tears, and Christie had run to her, excited to show her what the champ had drawn. The mother had looked at Ali over her daughter's head with an expression that contained gratitude and desperation, and a plea he couldn't quite interpret, but felt in his chest like a weight. The woman's name was Margaret. She'd introduced herself with a handshake that trembled, and she'd thanked Ali multiple times, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of emotion that she was clearly struggling to contain. She'd told him that Christie talked about him constantly, had watched the Zaire fight on television even though it was past her bedtime, had shadowboxed with her father in the living room trying to imitate Ali's style. Past tense again, Ali noticed, had shadowboxed, before the diagnosis, before the hospital, before life divided itself into before and after. What did it feel like to watch your child's future collapse into a series of treatments and prognoses? The nurse had suggested they visit some of the other children, and Ali had agreed, following her down the corridor, while Christie insisted on coming too, holding his hand again, claiming ownership of him in the way children do when they've decided someone is theirs. They'd passed a playroom where several kids were gathered, some in wheelchairs, some connected to IV poles that they wheeled alongside them like unwanted companions, all of them engaged in a puzzle that spread across a low table. Inside the next room, two boys were playing checkers, both of them bald from chemotherapy, both of them lighting up when they saw who'd walked through their door. One of them, Marcus, had immediately challenged Ali to arm wrestling, and Ali had pretended to struggle, had let Marcus win, had made a big show of being defeated by a 9-year-old with arms like twigs. Marcus had celebrated like he'd won the heavyweight championship itself, pumping his fist and doing a victory dance that made the ivy line swing wildly, and his roommate had laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise everyone in the room by its normalcy. Could Marcus feel how carefully Ali was calibrating his strength, or did he believe for a moment he was genuinely strong enough to beat the champ? The other boy, David, had been quieter, watching the arm wrestling with a small smile but not participating, and when Ali had asked him what he liked to do, David had shrugged, said he used to play baseball before he got sick. Used to. Past tense, like his life was already divided into before and after, like the person who'd played baseball was someone else entirely, a ghost that haunted him from the other side of his diagnosis. Ali had sat on the edge of David's bed and told him about playing baseball as a kid in Louisville, about being terrible at it, about preferring to hit people with boxing gloves instead of hitting balls with bats. David had laughed at that, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise him. Like he'd forgotten he could laugh, like joy was a foreign country he'd emigrated from and didn't expect to visit again. The sound had drawn a nurse who'd been passing by to stop and smile, and Allie had realized that laughter was probably rare here. That joy was a precious commodity in a place where children measured time in treatment cycles and blood counts, and the spaces between doses of pain medication. Marcus had wanted to know about the rumble in the jungle, wanted every detail, and Ali had obliged, acting out the fight right there in the hospital room, throwing slow-motion punches, doing the dope against an invisible foreman while both boys watched with rapt attention. He'd explained the strategy, how he'd let Foreman punch himself out, how he'd leaned against the ropes absorbing punishment until the moment was right, how patience and timing mattered more than pure power. How absurd it must have looked, a grown man shadowboxing in a pediatric cancer ward, but how necessary it felt in that moment. David had asked if it hurt, taking all those punches, and Ali had been honest. Yes, it hurt every single one, but you learned to separate the pain from the fear, to accept that hurt was temporary, but giving up was permanent. The words had landed with more weight than he'd intended, and both boys had gotten quiet, and Ali had wondered if they were thinking about their own pain, their own endurance, their own calculations about what was temporary and what was permanent. Marcus's mother had been there, too, sitting in a chair by the window trying to be invisible, and she'd started crying when Ali had acted out the fight, not sad crying, but relief crying, grateful crying. The release of tension that came from seeing her son engaged and happy and temporarily forgetting that he was sick. Ali had noticed and had extended the performance, had made it more elaborate, had even let himself get knocked down by invisible foremen and struggled back to his feet while the boys had cheered. The next room had held a teenage girl, 16 maybe, who'd been trying to read a magazine but clearly couldn't focus, her eyes scanning the same page over and over without absorbing any content. When she'd seen Ali, she'd tried to sit up straighter, to look less sick. That particular vanity that teenagers have even when their bodies are betraying them. Her name was Sarah, and she'd been beautiful once. You could see it in her bone structure, in the elegant way she held her head, but the chemo had taken her hair, and the illness had hollowed her cheeks, and what remained was a ghost of who she'd been. Ali had sat in the chair beside her bed and talked to her not like a sick kid, but like a person, asking about school, about friends, about what she wanted to do after, and that word, after, had hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither acknowledged. Sarah had wanted to be a writer, had notebooks full of stories she'd been working on, and Ali had asked to hear one, had listened as she'd read with a voice that grew stronger as she'd gotten lost in her own narrative. The story had been about a girl who could fly, who'd discovered one day that gravity no longer applied to her, and at first it had seemed like freedom, but then became isolating because she could no longer touch the ground, could no longer connect with the world she'd left behind. The metaphor hadn't been subtle, but it had been powerful, rendered in prose that was surprisingly sophisticated for a 16-year-old, with imagery that painted pictures in Ali's mind as vivid as Christie's crayon drawings. What words could possibly honor the pain embedded in that story? The flying girl in Sarah's story had tried to come back down but couldn't, had floated higher and higher until the earth became a distant sphere below her, until her family and friends were tiny dots she could barely distinguish from strangers. She'd screamed, but no one could hear her in the thin air, had reached down but her fingers passed through clouds without finding purchase, had eventually accepted that she was alone in a way that no one who remained tethered to gravity could understand. Finally, Sarah had told Ali the ending she was working on. The flying girl had met another flyer, someone else untethered from the world. And together they'd created their own country in the sky, a place where floating was normal and the ground was just a memory. It wasn't a happy ending exactly, but it was an acceptance, an acknowledgement that sometimes you couldn't go back, so you had to build something new wherever you ended up. When Sarah had finished reading, Ali had been quiet for a long moment, unsure what to say that wouldn't sound empty or patronizing. The silence had stretched between them, filled only by the beeping of monitors and the distant sound of a television in another room, and Sarah had watched him with eyes that seemed much older than 16. Eyes that had seen too much and understood things that shouldn't be comprehensible to someone so young. Finally, he'd told her it was beautiful, that she had real talent, that she should keep writing no matter what. Sarah had smiled, a sad knowing smile that suggested she understood the subtext. Keep writing for as long as you can, which might not be very long. Her mother had been there too, sitting in the corner with a book she wasn't reading, and she'd been crying silently, tears streaming down her face while her daughter read about flying away, about leaving the ground and everyone on it behind. How do you sit in a room and listen to your child write her own metaphor for dying? Ali had noticed that Sarah's room had more flowers than the others, vases crowding every surface, cards taped to the walls in layers, evidence of a community that cared and showed it the way people do when they know time is limited. But all the flowers and cards couldn't change the fundamental reality. Sarah was dying, her body slowly shutting down despite the best efforts of medicine and prayer and desperate love. The nurse had gently indicated they should move on, that there were more children to visit, and Ali had stood, had touched Sarah's hand, had told her he believed in her, and she'd gripped his fingers with surprising strength and said, "Thank you for seeing me," not thanking him for the visit, but for seeing her, recognizing her as more than her illness, more than a tragedy in progress, more than a dying girl in a hospital bed. The words had resonated with something deep in Ali's chest, a recognition that what people wanted most wasn't pity or even hope, but simply to be acknowledged as human, as complex, as worthy of attention beyond their suffering. He'd squeezed her hand back and promised to come visit again, and Sarah had nodded like she knew it might not happen, but appreciated the intention anyway. How many times had she been promised things that circumstances made impossible to deliver? Down the hall, a commotion. Doctors rushing into a room, alarms beeping with urgent regularity, the sudden organized chaos of a medical emergency. The nurse had steered Ali away from it, toward another wing, but he'd seen enough to understand, had caught a glimpse through the doorway of a small body surrounded by people trying to keep it alive, hands moving with practiced efficiency, voices calling out measurements and instructions in clinical language that stripped away the humanity of what they were fighting for. The nurse's face had been professionally neutral, but her hands had trembled slightly as she'd led him to the next room. And Ali had wondered how many times she'd witnessed this, how many children she'd cared for who hadn't made it, how she managed to come back shift after shift knowing that some of the kids she tended today wouldn't be here tomorrow. The emotional math of it seemed impossible. How do you invest in relationships that are statistically likely to end in death? What kind of person chooses to work in a place where heartbreak is guaranteed? Christie had been quiet since they'd heard the alarms, and Ali had looked down to find her face serious, contemplative, like she was processing something too big for words. She'd squeezed his hand tighter and said, "That happens sometimes. The alarms. And then someone's bed is empty." The matter of fact way she'd said it had been somehow more devastating than if she'd been upset. This casual acceptance of death as just another part of the hospital routine. The next several rooms had blurred together. More children, more parents with desperate eyes, more stuffed animals and cards and cheerful decorations that couldn't hide the fundamental tragedy of the place. A 5-year-old named Tommy who'd wanted Ali to do magic tricks, and Ali had improvised with coins and sleight of hand he barely remembered from childhood, making Tommy laugh and clap despite the tubes running into his arm. A set of twins, Emily and Emma, who'd finished each other's sentences and held hands even though they were in separate beds. Their connection so deep that being in different beds seemed like a cruel punishment on top of their illness. A boy named James who'd been too sick to sit up but had smiled when Ali had leaned down to talk to him, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes tracking Eileen's face with the intensity of someone trying to memorize details before they slipped away. James had asked if heaven had boxing matches, and Allie had frozen, unprepared for the theological implications, before answering that heaven probably had whatever made you happy. So if James liked watching fights, then yeah, heaven definitely had boxing. The answer had seemed to satisfy James, who'd closed his eyes and smiled, and his mother had touched Allie's arm and mouthed, "Thank you," with an expression that contained so much pain Allie had to look away. How many conversations had she had with her son about heaven, about what came after, about trying to make death sound less terrifying than it actually was? Each child had been fighting battles that made boxing look like child's play, facing opponents that couldn't be defeated with speed or strategy or strength of will. Ali had felt increasingly helpless, his championship belt a meaningless decoration, his fame unable to cure or even comfort beyond momentary distraction. What good was being the greatest when you couldn't save a single dying child? What did all his victories mean when stacked against the tragedy of children who'd never get to have victories of their own? Why had he come here, and was this helping anyone or just making him feel useful? But then he'd noticed something. The way the parents looked at him. Not with the usual fan worship, but with gratitude for breaking up the monotony of suffering, for giving their children something to smile about, for treating them like people instead of patients. One mother had pulled him aside in the hallway, thanked him with a grip on his arm that was almost painful in its intensity, and told him that her son hadn't smiled in 3 weeks until Ali had walked in doing his butterfly impression. 3 weeks. 21 days without a smile. And Ali had given that back with 5 minutes of shadowboxing and silly voices and pretending to be defeated by a child's strength. The math of it stunned him. Such a small thing on his part creating such a significant impact on theirs. He'd spent hours training for fights, months preparing for championship bouts, years building a career, and somehow this afternoon in a hospital was feeling more important than any of it. Could suffering be measured by the absence of joy, and could joy be delivered in such small packages? They'd continued through the ward, and Ali had lost count of how many children he'd met, how many stories he'd heard, how many hands he'd held that were too small and too cold and too fragile. Some of the kids had known who he was, had been excited to meet the champ, had asked for autographs on whatever paper was available, napkins, hospital minutes, the backs of treatment schedules. Others had been too young or too sick to care about boxing or fame, had just been happy to have a visitor who wasn't a doctor or nurse, someone who talked to them about normal things like school and hobbies and favorite foods. Christie had stayed with him the whole time, this small shadow at his side, introducing him to other kids, showing him around like this was her domain and he was the guest. She'd explained the rhythms of the ward, when medications were distributed, when meals arrived, when the doctors did their rounds, when visiting hours ended and the parents who could leave did, while the ones who couldn't settled into uncomfortable chairs for another night of vigil. The knowledge she'd accumulated was staggering. She knew which nurses were the nicest, which doctors had the coldest hands, which kids were doing well and which ones were losing ground. She'd created a mental map of the ward's ecosystem, had learned to navigate its systems and hierarchies, had developed survival skills that no 7-year-old should need. How does a child become an expert on dying when she should be an expert on cartoons and playground games? As they'd walked, Ali had noticed other things. The way certain rooms were kept darker because light hurt the children's eyes, the way some parents had essentially moved in with sleeping bags and changes of clothes, the way the staff spoke in hushed tones as if loud voices might shatter something fragile. He'd seen a janitor crying in a supply closet, had seen a doctor lean against a wall with his eyes closed looking utterly exhausted, had seen 2 nurses hugging each other in a stairwell without saying a word. The ward was its own universe with its own rules and rhythms, a place set apart from the normal world where children were supposed to be healthy and parents weren't supposed to bury their kids. Everyone who entered it, visitors, staff, family, was changed by it, marked by proximity to suffering that shouldn't exist but did, that couldn't be fixed but had to be endured. In another room, they'd found a boy named Carlos who was practicing walking again, taking shaky steps between his bed and the wall while a physical therapist encouraged him. The treatment had damaged his nervous system, had stolen his coordination, and now he was relearning basic movements that most people took for granted. Carlos had been embarrassed at first when he'd seen Allie watching, but Allie had told him that he'd had to relearn how to fight after his layoff. That starting over was just part of being a champion. The comparison was generous to the point of dishonesty, but Carlos had accepted it gratefully. Had asked Allie to watch him walk the length of the room, had concentrated with fierce intensity on putting one foot in front of the other. When he'd made it without falling, Ali had applauded, and Carlos had beamed with pride that made the lie worth telling. What's the harm in a small deception if it gives someone dignity? Christie had shown Ali her favorite spot, a window at the end of the hallway that looked out over the city, where she could see cars and buildings and people living normal lives. She'd told him she came here when the treatments made her sick, when the fear got too big, when she needed to remember that a world existed beyond these walls. They'd stood there together looking out at the late afternoon, watching the sun try to break through clouds, and Christie had said, "Sometimes I imagine I'm out there, just walking around being normal." The longing in her voice had destroyed Allie, this fundamental desire for something most people had and never appreciated. The freedom to be well, to move through the world without pain or limitation, to be a kid instead of a patient. He'd wanted to promise her that she'd get to do that she'd be cured and go home and live a normal life, but the words had stuck in his throat, unable to force out promises he had no way of keeping. Instead, he'd asked her what she'd do first if she could leave tomorrow, and Christie had thought about it seriously before answering. She'd want to go to the park, just sit on a swing and feel the wind on her face, maybe feed the ducks if there were any. Simple pleasures, ordinary moments that had become unattainable luxuries. Things most children did without thinking, but Christie could only dream about from her window at the end of the hallway. How many swings remained empty because children were trapped in hospital beds? They'd returned to Christie's room eventually, and she'd pulled out a notebook from her bedside table, pages filled with careful handwriting that wavered in places where her strength had given out. Inside were letters, dozens of them, addressed to people she'd never get to meet. Future teachers, future friends, a future husband, future children she'd never have. Each letter started the same way. "I don't know if I'll be here when you read this, but I wanted you to know. My mom said I should write down things I want to say." Christie had explained, "So even if I'm not here, the words still are." The casual way she'd talked about her own absence had broken something in Allie, had made his throat tight and his eyes burn with tears he was trying to hide. She'd been 7 years old and writing her own legacy, creating a paper trail of existence, because she understood with terrible clarity that her time was limited, that she might not get to say these things in person. That ink and paper might outlast her body. What kind of world makes children prepare for their own non-existence? Ailey had asked if he could read one, and Christie had hesitated, protective of these private thoughts, before handing him a letter addressed to whoever finds this. The handwriting was careful, the kind of concentration that comes from forming each letter deliberately, and the content had destroyed him. "I don't want to be forgotten. I was here. I liked butterflies and ice cream and my mom's hugs. I was scared a lot, but I tried to be brave. If you find this, please remember that I existed, that I mattered, that I wasn't just the sick girl, but Christie who liked to draw and dreamed about flying." The paper had shaken in Allie's hands, and he'd realized he was crying, tears running down his face in a hospital room, while a 7-year-old girl watched him with ancient eyes that had seen things no child should see, understood things no child should understand. Christie had reached up, touched his cheek, wiped away a tear with her small fingers, and said, "It's okay to be sad. My mom cries all the time. I'm used to it. The permission she'd given him, the grace in that gesture, had made it worse and better simultaneously. She'd been comforting him about her own death, offering absolution for his grief, showing more emotional maturity than most adults could manage. Ali had pulled her into a careful hug, aware of how fragile she was, how easily she might break, and Christie had hugged him back with more strength than he'd expected, her small arms wrapped around his neck like she was holding on to life itself. When they'd separated, Christie had shown him more letters, one to her mom thanking her for everything, one to her dad apologizing for being sick, one to her future sister or brother explaining who she was in case they were born after she was gone. Each letter was a small knife to Ali's heart. This accumulation of goodbyes from someone who shouldn't have to say them yet. How does a parent read their child's posthumous letters and continue breathing? He'd stayed with Christie for another hour, long past when he was supposed to leave, sitting on her bed while she'd shown him more drawings, told him more stories, shared more of the interior life she'd built as defense against the reality of her situation. Her mother had eventually suggested Christie needed to rest, and Ali had agreed reluctantly, had stood to go but found he couldn't quite leave, kept finding reasons to linger. One more drawing to admire, one more story to hear, one more moment to delay the goodbye that felt too final. Finally, Christie had said, "You have to go now. Other people need you too." 7 years old and already understanding duty, sacrifice, the way attention has to be divided among those who need it. Ali had nodded, had leaned down to hug her carefully one more time, and she'd hugged him back and whispered in her ear, "Thank you for making me feel special. Not sick special, but special, special." The distinction had gutted him because it was true. Most people treated sick children with a particular kind of attention that was really about the sickness, the tragedy, the pity of it all. Christie wanted to be seen as special for who she was, not what was happening to her, and somehow Ali had managed to do that. To look past the illness to the person underneath who liked butterflies and ice cream and dreamed about flying. He'd walked out of that room knowing he was different than when he'd walked in, that Christie had changed him in ways he couldn't fully articulate yet. That meeting her had shifted something fundamental in his understanding of what mattered. The hallway seemed longer on the way out, each step taking him further from that room where a 7-year-old girl was writing letters to a future she might never see. How many people had he affected in his life, and how many had affected him more profoundly than he'd affected them? The nurse had walked him out, through the ward, past all those rooms full of suffering children and exhausted parents and staff members who showed up every day to fight battles they often lost. At the elevator, she'd thanked him, said his visit had meant more than he could know, that these children needed hope and joy and the feeling that the outside world still saw them, still remembered they existed beyond their diagnosis. Ali had thanked her back, had told her she was doing God's work, that he was just a boxer, but she was saving lives, or at least making lives worth living for as long as they lasted. She'd shaken her head, had said, "We lose more than we save. You gave them something we can't. A reason to smile today. Sometimes that's all we can hope for, one more good day." The pragmatism of it, the acceptance of limitations, had impressed Ali, had made him realize that courage looked different in different contexts, that these nurses and doctors fighting pediatric cancer were warriors in their own right, just with different weapons and different definitions of victory. The elevator had arrived and Ali had stepped in, turned to face the closing doors, caught one last glimpse of the ward. Fluorescent lights, pale walls. Children who shouldn't be there fighting battles they shouldn't have to fight. The doors had closed, sealing him off from that world, and he'd sagged against the wall. Emotionally exhausted in a way that training and fighting never made him, drained by the accumulated weight of too much suffering, compressed into too small a space. Could you train for heartbreak the way you trained for boxing, or were some opponents unbeatable? In the elevator, alone for the first time in hours, Ali had let himself fully feel what he'd been holding back. The grief, the anger, the helplessness, the rage at a universe that let children suffer like this. His hands had made fists without his conscious direction, muscle memory responding to emotion with the impulse to fight. But there was no opponent to hit, no problem that could be solved with violence or strategy or determination. The elevator had descended slowly, passing floors where different dramas played out, where people recovered from surgeries and learned to walk again and celebrated being discharged, where the news was often good and the prognosis hopeful. But Ali's mind was still on the pediatric oncology ward, still seeing Christie's drawings and Sarah's notebooks and David's quiet resignation and Marcus's fierce determination to win at arm wrestling even though he was dying. Outside, the December sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that seemed obscene in their beauty, as if the universe didn't know or care that children were dying inside that building. Ali's driver had been waiting, had opened the door, and Ali had climbed in mechanically, his mind still back in Christie's room, still seeing her drawings, still hearing her read about butterflies and ice cream, and wanting to be remembered. The driver had asked how it went, making conversation the way drivers do, and Ali had just shaken his head, unable to find words for what he'd experienced, unable to compress the afternoon into a simple answer that would fit the casual inquiry. They'd driven in silence through Los Angeles traffic, past people living their normal lives, shopping and working and worrying about things that suddenly seemed trivial compared to leukemia and pediatric oncology and 7-year-olds writing letters to futures they'd never see. The city looked different now, or maybe Ali was different, seeing everything through the lens of what he'd just witnessed. Every child he passed on the street registered differently. Were they healthy? Did they know how lucky they were? Would they grow up to be adults, or would something steal that future away? The questions buzzed in his mind like insects, impossible to swat away, making him hyper-aware of fragility and fortune and the randomness of who suffered and who didn't. At home, his wife had taken one look at his face and known, had wrapped him in her arms and let him cry properly, the kind of crying that came from deep places where words couldn't reach, where emotion lived too big for language. He'd told her about Christie, about all of them, about feeling helpless and privileged and angry at a universe that let children suffer while he got to be healthy and famous and successful for doing something as meaningless as hitting people. His wife had listened, had held him, had reminded him that showing up mattered, that giving those children a few hours of normalcy was not nothing, that sometimes the best you could do was be present and bear witness and treat suffering with the dignity it deserved. But her words couldn't quite reach the place where his guilt lived, the gnawing feeling that he should be able to do more, that his fame and money and influence should somehow translate into the power to save dying children. But it felt like nothing compared to what they needed, what they deserved. Ali had fought his way out of poverty, had beaten the best fighters in the world, had stood up to the U.S. government, and won. But he couldn't fight leukemia, couldn't beat cancer with dope strategy, couldn't save Christie no matter how much he wanted to or how many punches he could throw. What good was strength when the opponent was microscopic, invisible, operating according to rules that didn't care about will or determination? That night, sleep had come hard, interrupted by images of pale children and empty beds and Christie's careful handwriting explaining that she didn't want to be forgotten. Ali had gotten up around 3 in the morning, had gone to his office and written a check, a large check, more money than most people made in a year, to the hospital's Pediatric Cancer Research Fund. The money couldn't save Christie, probably couldn't save any of the children he'd met today, but maybe it could help find treatments for children not yet diagnosed, could fund research that would make someone else's visit to that ward less heartbreaking in 10 or 20 years. The check had felt inadequate, a wealthy man's way of trying to buy absolution or meaning, or some sense that he'd done something useful beyond just showing up and making kids smile for a few hours. But he'd sent it anyway, because doing something insufficient was better than doing nothing at all. Because standing in the ring meant throwing punches even when you weren't sure they'd land, even when the opponent seemed unbeatable. He'd also written a letter to Christie, trying to find words that would matter, that would give her something to hold on to when the treatments got bad and the fear got big. The letter had gone through several drafts, each one feeling wrong or inadequate, before he'd settled on something simple, a promise to come back. A reminder that she was brave and special, and a request that she keep drawing because the world needed her art. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was what he had to give. Days had passed, then weeks, and Ali had tried to return to normal life. Training, interviews, appearances, the machinery of being Muhammad Ali continuing its relentless operation. But Christie's face had haunted